In this video, we're going to be talking about making mock-up templates for Canva. Now, you see this sort of thing for sale all the time on places like Etsy, sometimes done sort of okay, other times done not so well. But what are the things you need to consider when you're making a mock-up template like this for Canva? What can you do natively in Canva? What can you not do? What are the 3 or 4 things you may have to consider when making a mock-up? And then which of those you can sometimes ignore? So we're going to look at all of that. We're going to look at how we can use other tools outside of Canva to help us create assets for Canva, but then we're also going to look at the pros and cons, the limitations of each approach, so you understand what you can do, what you can't do, and what's your best option depending on the circumstances you're facing, what particular mockup you're trying to make. So let's get right into it. So it makes sense to start with the question, what is a mockup anyway? Well, in simplest terms, mockup is just a visual representation in the real world of your design. So maybe you've created a logo, so you have that as a flat design on your computer screen, but then what is that going to look like on a business card? What is it going to look like on a soda can? What is it going to look like on a t-shirt? Maybe you have a picture. What's that picture going to look like on a billboard? What's that picture going to look like printed on a blanket? Okay, so a mock-up is sort of a visual representation of what maybe your end product is going to look like in the real world. So this is going to be a bit of a longer tutorial, so I can really cover things in detail for you, but because of that, I've created some timestamps here if you want to jump to a specific part of the video, and I'll also have these timestamps in the description down below of this video. Let's start by taking a look at what options exist natively here within Canva. So if we come under this apps tab, and then we come down to these apps here, you're going to see this mockups option. And if you click on this mockups option, you have all sorts of different categories from smartphones and digital devices, from print products to apparel, to computers, to frames, home and living, packaging, outdoor, graphics, tablets and TVs. You have a lot of different options, and with any of these, you can click in under a category. So I can go under this print category and see more and more options, and there actually are quite a few options in all these different categories. So if I click on this one here to bring it on screen, then I can go ahead and I can resize this. So I'm going to size this up a fair amount, and we can see that this has what we can recognize as a Canva frame here, because we're seeing this sort of icon here, which indicates it's a frame. You can drop an image into it, but then we're also seeing it has a drop shadow underneath, and it has a shadow here on top. And then if I come under my uploads tab here, and I just find any sort of photo that I have, I can go ahead and drop something into a frame. So I'm just under uploads, but of course I could go under Canva elements and find any picture there and drop it into that. And when I do that, we see that it automatically places the item within the frame. Not only that, but we still have this curved effect. We have the shadow effect. We have some shadow overlay. So there really is a good amount going on here. And so this is a pretty cool option. Now, anytime you use any one of these mockups under that mockup app I just showed you, you're going to have this edit option when you have it selected. And when you have this edit option here, you can move things around. And so you can move something around, and then you can apply the changes. You can size it up, you can reposition, you can apply the changes, and sometimes you have options here for if you want to flip the graphic thing horizontally, vertically, so you have these different options. Sometimes there'll be some color options here, so if I choose this blue color, let's go ahead and apply and see what we get there. So I'm going to choose this blue here, and if I click out of that, I can apply changes. And we're not seeing that blue color because basically the graphic is taking up all the space here. But what if I use just the logo itself without that pink background? So if you want to change what you have in your mockup, of course you can just drag another image over top of it. So let me go back under my uploads, and I have another version of the logo here that has some transparency behind it. I was using this before, which has this pink background, but here's one that has some transparency. And so if I drop that in there now we're seeing that blue color that was in there before. Now I don't know why I'm still getting that pink background, because it shouldn't have that. So sometimes if it doesn't update completely, let me try this again and drop this in one more time. So there we go. So now every time, sometimes it'll take a little bit to update here, but now if I were to come back under the edit menu, now if I was to go under that color option and go ahead and click apply, so click on the color, click out, apply, then we'll see we do get that in the background. And of course, if I wanted to size this up, I can come in here, I can size this up, I can reposition, apply. So you have these basic options with all the different mockups. Now, you're not always going to have this color option, but you're always going to have the ability to sort of scale how it fits, reposition how it fits within the mockup. So actually quite a lot of options underneath this Mockups tab in Canva. So this is a great starting point if you're looking to create a mockup. Sometimes you're going to find exactly what you need under this Mockup app. So let's take a look at a few more of the mockups I found under this Mockups app, just to get a good feel for the extras that you sometimes get with these. So if we look at this one here, we have the hands over top of the frame itself, and also this ribbon over top of the frame. And all I have to do is again drag in this picture. So we have this packaging mockup, and boom, it fits nicely in there with these two overlays over top. So this is really actually a nice feature that sometimes you get these extras that sort of add to the overall feel of the mockup. Another example here, if we look at this billboard, we can see this billboard is positioned at an angle to the frame. So as opposed to something straight on where you're looking at a plane that's parallel to the camera lens, the lens of the camera frame, we have something here where it's angled away. So you're going to get foreshortening. You will actually have the image sort of change perspective. So if you're starting with a flat image like this, it needs to be transformed. And when you drag something into the frame, you'll see that that transformation is happening automatically. In other words, this side here is longer than this side, and it's automatically performing that transform for you. So again, this is really nice, and this is not something easily to natively do within Canva. Now, there is an app in Canva that will let you do this sort of thing, and I can post a link to that video up here. But again, it's not perfect. And it is very clunky, so it's not always something that I recommend doing in Canva. So whenever you have a mockup like this where it's built in and it's done correctly, that is a nice feature, and that's something that can be a little bit tricky if you have to do it on its own. So again, a nice feature of this mockup here. Same thing with this mug here. We can see that when you have a mug like this, it actually needs to curve around the surface of the mug. If we just had a photo that just stayed flat and didn't change perspective at all, didn't transform at all, then it would look a little awkward. But so when I go ahead and I drag this in here, we can see if we give it a minute that it's actually going to do that transformation automatically. And this mockup here, you'll notice the play button. Some of these mockups in here actually have some motion, some animation, so you have these video mockups as well. And we can see if we look at this line here, yes, it is curved. Now I might want to come in here and I might want to scale this up, so you can always just use this fill option. It's automatically going to fill the frame. I'll go ahead and apply these changes, and then we'll hit the play button to just see that this does have some motion. So again, these are both nice features of using some of these custom built mockups for Canva. So that's always a great place to start, just to see if they have what you need, if it covers what you need, because then that can save you a lot of time and work. So if I go ahead and hit this play button here, now we'll see that we can see some steam coming out of the coffee. And there are other ones here that have even more motion, so you can play around and look within this Mockups app and at the different categories and see that there are some good options. So let's look at just two more of these mockups here. So if I come over to this one here, we have this pillow mockup. So again, drag something in, and this time we can see how you really have shadows, but you also have some texture that's being carried through here. And then going to one more mockup, we have this sort of tumbler glass here, and we can see because of the reflective material on this particular item here, we have some highlights here. So again, if I drag in the photo here, I can reposition this if I want to. Let's just maybe scale it down slightly and bring it back this way a little bit, apply changes. But again, we're seeing that we have that reflection on the surface. And so the reason why I highlighted these particular mockups is to point out several of the things that you may need to consider when you're creating your own custom mockup. And so the first of those things that we're going to have to consider are lighting and shadows. So if we look back at this mockup here, because of the curvature of this and light in the scene, you're getting the shadow on this side, and we also have the shadow on the sort of sticker itself here. Looking at another mockup here, because of the light in the scene and the curvature on this bag, you're getting shadows on this mockup as well. So you're going to have to pay attention to the lighting of your scene, and then any surface material, how it may, fold and create shadows. And so paying attention to lighting and shadows, that's going to be important. If you want to have an effective mockup, you have to have that built into your mockup in some fashion. The next thing we want to think about is texture. So if we look at this pillow here, we have the lighting and shadows, but if we zoom in here, we also can see where we're picking up this texture of the pillow. So if you want a realistic mock-up, you're going to have to think about surface material and texture, things like that, because you need to portray that in your mock-up if you want it to be more realistic. Now the next thing is there any transformation or displacement? So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at this one here, we remember that with this we have something that's angled away from the camera. So we do have this foreshortening that's going to take place. Same thing with something like this pillow here. What's happening when there are curves in the pillow? This tumbler here, it's curving around the curve of the surface material. So anytime you have something like that where you're taking a flat image and putting it on a surface that's not flat, then we're going to have to think about, do we need to have some sort of transformation, some sort of displacement of pixels to take place? And then the final thing to think about sometimes, what about surface material, and is there any sort of reflectivity? When you have a surface material like this, that's sort of a high sheen surface material that will reflect light, then suddenly we can get these highlights, these reflections on our surface. So that's another thing that we may have to consider. So again, just to review, the lighting and shadows in the scene, the texture of the object, the perspective of the object, is there any sort of displacement or distortion that needs to take place? And then finally, the surface material of the object, is that going to result in any sort of highlights or shadows, reflections, things like that? So these are all things we may have to consider. I say may have to consider because sometimes it's just a case of what you can get away with and still have a realistic mock-up. So we're going to look at all of that as we move forward. So let's just finish up looking at the options here inside of Canva, and then we'll look at how you can step outside of Canva and create assets that you can bring back into Canva. So in Canva, we mentioned before how if you go under your Apps tab, you can find this Mockups tab, again under Apps, and you come down to this set of options from Canva here, and you find this Mockups option. But there is another sort of mockup option if you're working on an image. And so I don't think this works with the native Canva Pro elements, but if you have your own image or you create one with the AI image generator, which is what I use to create this frame image here, then if you come in under this edit menu here, you're going to get into all of these options here. And if we come down here, here is another mockups option here. Now this is slightly different than the mockups option we were getting before, because if I click on this, we're still seeing different categories, but also up here we see this custom option. So create a mockup template, tap to generate your custom mockup template. So this will take a photo that you bring in or a photo you create with the AI image generator, and it will attempt to create a custom mockup from that image. So it's going to look within your photo, try to find potential areas that it thinks make sense to sort of turn into one of these custom frame mockups. And the best way to see how this works is just to run this tool. So we're going to run it on this frame here. And you'll notice the crown icon here. So this is a Pro feature. This is available to you if you have Canva Pro. If anybody does want to try Canva Pro, I can put a link down below in the comments for a free 30-day trial. Now that is an affiliate link, so that doesn't change anything for you, but it does mean I could earn a slight commission if you end up signing up for the Pro version of Canva after that 30-day trial. So I'll put that down in the comments below. Now, before we even run this, we can see that one of the issues we have here is that this is an angled frame. So we're not going to be able to take a flat image and put this into this frame. So for this to work, Canva is going to have to do some sort of transform. Let's just see if this Create a Mockup tool is able to A, find the area that is actually the frame itself, and then B, is it able to do any sort of transform? So we're going to go ahead and do this Create a Mockup, and this is going to sort of think about it for a second, and then the way this works, it's going to show you some potential areas once it finishes running here, and you're going to get to choose which one you want to turn into sort of your mockup template. So we can see here, it doesn't really look like it's found anything here except for that bow, so it's picking out this bow. I can't tell what it's picking out there. Here it's picking out the whole thing, but this one here looks kind of promising because it looks like, based on the image of the cloud here in this landscape, this sort of image for a frame, it looks like maybe it's finding the frame itself. So let's go ahead and click on this one and we'll hit confirm, and it's going to go ahead and process this now and attempt to turn this into a frame where we can just drop an image in. Okay, so it looks like it's done a reasonable job, but if I look at this here, certainly not perfect, because if we zoom in, it's doing something weird here, and it looks like it's missing this corner here. Now let me just go ahead and drop a photo into this so we can see how it's working. Let me actually go under the Elements tab here. I'm just gonna hit this to see the recent ones. I'll go ahead and drag this picture in here. And so, again, it's putting the image in there, so that's good. It is maintaining the overlays here of this bow over top and at the bottom here, but it's got a weird little aspect going on down here. It's missing the corner, and also it's doing some sort of transform, but I can't quite tell if it's working correctly. So let me just tell you from my experience using this option here. So again, I went to selected a photo, went under the edit menu, found that mockups option under the edit menu. It's going to attempt to create its own mockup, but what I found with this tool is it's sort of hit or miss whether it finds the right area within your photo. It often has these artifacts and doesn't do a perfect job, and then also it often doesn't get the transform correct. Sometimes it's close, but it's usually a little bit off. Now, a good way to check something like this would be to put something that has straight lines in here so we can see a little bit better the transform that is taking place. So let me just come back under the Elements tab. I'm going to search something for grid just so we get some horizontal and vertical lines that are going to tell us a little bit better what's going on here. So it doesn't have to be anything perfect, but let's just drag this in here and see what we get. Now, it didn't actually replace that. Let's give it another try. Again, sometimes it'll take a minute to update things. So if we look at this, we can see that this grid, which is just straight like this, it is doing some sort of transformation, but we can see that it definitely isn't correct, right? Because we would expect these lines here to sort of be parallel to this line here and this one down here. So it isn't doing that transform correct. So this option here, let me just get rid of all of this and just find another photo here. So let me just go to this photo here. Again, if I were to click on this one here and again go into the edit menu, this is where we're going under here and we're finding this Mockups app and we're finding this create a mockup template. And this is where I found that it can work sometimes, but most of the time it falls short. It doesn't work very well. So we could run it on this as well. Let me just do that real quick just to see what it does with this one. This one we don't have to do the transform. It's just sort of a flat plane. So not transforming the image at all is probably going to be fine. So maybe it has a little bit better chance with this one. So let's go ahead and run this anyways. So I'll go ahead and click this again. It's hopefully going to find the area of my frame. Again, I bet it's going to miss this corner down here. So again, that's something that's not going to be perfect. We see that it doesn't always work perfectly, but here, this one here looks a little bit promising. So we'll go ahead and confirm that. And we'll go ahead and bring that in here. Again, there's a shadow here. Is it going to find that shadow? No, it lost the shadow. It looked like it lost the corner there. So I'm not even going to drag an image into this just because I can tell it didn't quite do a good enough job. So this mockups option here where you create your own custom mockup, a pro feature within Canva, maybe there's hope for the future if this gets a little bit better, but right now I just think most of the time it's not going to get the job done. So let me just hit Control Z to undo this and get back to just the original image here. So it kind of seems like we're out of luck if we wanted to have a mockup where we have these bows over top of the image and then a frame here, or are we? I actually think there are tools in Canva, if you're a pro user, where you could turn this into a reasonable mockup. So let's give it a try. And so the feature I'm talking about here that we're going to need for this is the Magic Grab tool, because there isn't really a great tool in Canva for making selections, but sometimes with the Magic Grab tool, you can get it to grab the things you want. So what I'm going to do is click on the photo here. We're going to again come under the edit menu. This time I'm going to go over and grab this Magic Grab option. And then when you do the Magic Grab tool, it's going to automatically search within your photo to try to find areas it might grab. So it's grabbed that area here. It's grabbed the bow over here, which is great because I want to definitely put that on its own layer. This one here, it's not finding, but we can get around that, I think. But let's start here with this click option. We're just going to click on the bow. We're going to go ahead and click grab. So if you haven't used the Magic Grab tool before, what it does is it attempts to find areas within your photo. It'll then cut out that area, it'll put it up on its own layer. So if we look at the position menu here and we go to layers, we now see that we have this bow on its own layer. We can move it around. Now it's attempting to fill the pixels behind that. It hasn't done a great job of that, but that's not going to matter because we're going to keep that bow right in position here. So we found that part, but we can still go back to the original and run the magic grab tool again, because now I'm going to try to grab this bottom section here. So again, once again, I'll go under the edit menu. Once again, I'll use this magic grab tool. Now under this click options, it's trying to auto find places and it's not finding this bottom ribbon here, but that's where you can use the brush tool. And so if you're using the brush tool here, what you want to do is try to brush over an area where there is a clear, distinct separation between the area you're brushing over and then the area beside it. So this is pretty distinct here, so I'm hoping we can just grab this bow. So I'm going to lower my brush size down a little bit, but then I'm just going to brush over this general area, going slightly beyond it, because you want to be beyond that edge where there's that contrast. And then we're going to go ahead and click grab and see what kind of job it does. It doesn't have to do perfect, but I think that's going to be reasonable. Now we won't know until we sort of put a frame behind this. So now if we look at our layer menu now, we have both of these bows on top. So I'll go ahead and click on both of those. I could group them together, but I'm not going to, because I don't want to obscure what I'm going to have behind this, which is going to be a frame. So I'm going to come under my Elements tab, and I'm just going to search for a native Canva frame, because since we're not doing any sort of transform in terms of putting this photo at an angle, just a basic frame here should work fine. So I'm going to get it to roughly where the edge of my frame is. I'll drag it down to roughly where the bottom of the frame is. Make sure I get it filling the space I want it to fill up. So something like that. But then what I'm going to do is, just using my Control and bracket keyboard shortcuts, I'm going to go ahead and put that behind those ribbons. Now I could have done that using the layers menu, just moving it up and down like this, but so now I have it behind there. And because this bow here is sort of on this side and this one's here, I still have open space here where I can drag something directly into my frame. So now if I go find a photo, drag it into my frame, boom, just like that, I'm dragging it into the frame. Now, if I wanted to make this mock-up even better, what I could actually do would be to create a duplicate of this bow here. So let me just come over top of this, and I'm going to go ahead and duplicate. And then you've probably seen me do this trick before if you watch this channel, but with any image here, you can go under the edit menu, just use this duotone option. I'm going to use this custom option. I'm just going to push it both to black, and then we're going to go back and we're going to use this blur option, and we will blur this slightly using the whole image option. Just blur it slightly because we're going to use this as a drop shadow. And so now if I come back and I just take the position of that and I drop it behind my bow there, and then I come in here and lower down the transparency, now suddenly we're getting this sort of drop shadow where you might have something behind the bow. Now I could do that as well for this option down here, but I'm not going to do that. You get the idea. But the idea here is that we could create a Canva asset where now if I want to use this as a mockup template, I can very easily come in here and very easily add new images to this frame very quickly. So that's the whole idea. You want to create something that gives you that end product that can be easily updated and save you time. So we're starting to see some of the limitations of Canva. You can do some things like the magic grab tool will sometimes select things, but Canva definitely not great for making selections. Let's look at another basic example here. You can't do image transforms easily in Canva if you have to change perspective, but if you're working with something like a flat surface, and so maybe you wanted to have sort of a mock-up to make something look like it was on canvas, you could attempt to do something in here, and you could make an attempt to bring back the texture. So we have this sort of Canva element here that's just sort of this brown canvas. I have this frame here which we're just going to place right on top, so you can size that out. I actually have the transparency lower down. Let's just bring that back up for a second. So I could drag something in here, and then if I just fool with the transparency, because of course you're going to see that canvas texture, so I could drag this down a little bit, and suddenly that's starting to look reasonable. Another option here, this page here, this also has the canvas, and if we zoom in, there definitely is a canvas texture here, but same thing this time. If I drag this element over and then I suddenly come in here and attempt to put the image on top, let's zoom in a little bit so we can see a little bit better. I'll try the same trick for lowering down the transparency, but we'll see I have to really lower it down to start to see that texture. and then suddenly this is becoming a little too faded. So sometimes something might work in Canva, but a lot of times it's just not going to get the job done. So let's step outside of Canva now and see what other options we have. Now, I recommend using programs like Photoshop, Affinity Photo. Those are paid programs though. So if you want a free option, I also talk sometimes on this channel about using the site Photopea. So that's photopea.com. And so let's jump over there now and see some of the options we do have in there for when it comes to creating mockups and doing some of those more complicated things that you can't necessarily do here inside of Canva. So here we are inside of Photopea, and you can get to this on your computer just by going to photopea.com, and it's just an online image editor, and it's one that mimics Photoshop. It's not as robust as Photoshop, so if you have Photoshop, go ahead and use Photoshop. And then there are other tools you might have like Affinity Photo. If you like open source software and you're willing to download and learn, there are programs like GIMP. So there are a lot of options, and I always recommend being willing to go beyond Canva because it's great for lots of things, but also it does have its shortcomings, so sometimes you do need to step into other software. So I'm in the free version here. You don't even have to sign up for this. What you're not seeing just off the right side of my screen is it does show sort of a row of ads as part of their monetization for the free version. That's why they can offer the free version. And there is an upgraded version if you want to go look at what the pro features are. But we're just going to be using the free version today. And again, I know a lot of people are on a budget, so I do recommend Photopea if you just want a simple free tool that is going to let you do a lot of extra things that can be helpful when creating additional assets for Canva. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go ahead and open from my computer, and I've saved that square canvas, which we just looked at in this last example here, where we couldn't quite get the look we wanted. So what I'm going to be doing now is using Photopea to create a texture overlay I can then bring back into Canva. Now I'll be talking through things as I go, so hopefully you'll learn as you go, but also just feel free to follow this channel because I have tutorials like this all the time, and I have a lot of good resources. And so just stay patient, practice. You're going to get the hang of these things. They may seem complicated at first, but it's really not bad once you just practice them a little. So what I'm going to do is just grab this selection tool here, and I'm just really interested in the canvas area, so I'm just going to get basically a selection around that. I just want it to be close. And then I'll go ahead and use the Control-J keyboard shortcut, and that's just going to put that selected area up on a new layer. So now I just have the area that is my canvas. Now if I use my zoom tool here and I zoom in, it's basically these dark little flecks, these dark little pixels, which I want to select and bring onto another layer, because then I'm going to be able to export that layer with transparency and have something I can bring into Canva to use as a texture overlay that's going to have this canvas feel. So let's just go ahead and work through this. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I actually am going to switch this, invert this image so that my dark areas become light and my light areas become dark. And I'll explain why I'm going to do that in a second. So to do that, I'm just going to come under here and I'm going to use the Control-I keyboard shortcut with that layer selected, and it's going to swap that. Now I also could have come up here and gone image and adjustments, and I could have found this invert command. We can see Control+I. So I just used the keyboard shortcut. And so now if I zoom in on this a little bit, we can see that now it's really this white areas, the lighter areas that I want to select. Now a good way to partially select whatever you have on screen is the trick I'm going to use now, making a selection based on luminance values. So luminance values, it just mean brightness. You can make a selection in a program like this or Photoshop based on brightness values. If something is white, it will select it completely. If a pixel is black, it won't select it at all. It's going to ignore it. If something is like gray, like middle gray, then it's sort of going to make a 50% selection where there's like 50% transparency. So to illustrate this, what I'm going to do is come under this channels option here, and I can make this sort of selection just by control clicking on this RGB channel. So again, on my layers, I have the layer I want selected. I'm going to go under channels, and I'm going to hold down the control key, and I'm going to select on this channel. So control click and select right on that RGB channel. Now, it may not be obvious at first that you've made a selection. Let me just zoom out here a little bit so we can see zoomed out a little bit. Let's try that again, zooming out. It may not be obvious. I can see that I have this dotted sort of outline if I zoom in here. So if I zoom in on the bottom here, we can see that yes, some pixels are being selected. It's hard to see every pixel that's being selected, but we're going to see that in a minute now when we copy these onto another layer. So again, to copy selected pixels onto a new layer, I have the layer selected. I'm again using that Control-J keyboard shortcut. So now if I turn off this existing layer, we can see that I have some stuff up on a new layer. Now it's hard to tell at this moment what I have because mostly we're seeing through to the background here, but there is stuff on this layer. If I want to see a little bit better, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'll create a solid color fill layer. Let's just make it red. And then if I drag that behind the layer, now suddenly we can see by turning this top layer on and off that it is bringing in this canvas-like texture. And so this is the texture now that I want to export out of here with this transparency back into Canva. So let's go File, let's go Save As or Export As. We're going to choose this PNG option. Then we're going to go ahead and save it. Tell it where you want to save it. I'll just put it in this one here, Square Canvas. Sure, let's call that Square Canvas Texture Overlay. I actually did this once before, but I'll just overwrite that. And then we're going to go ahead and replace that. So now I have that new image here. So now if I jump back into Canva, here's that project where we were having the problem of having the image be too faded if we really wanted to show the texture. So now let's go ahead and bring in our texture overlay and see how that's going to work. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that texture overlay, bring it right here under the Uploads tab. It's going to go ahead and upload right here. And now once I've done that, I can go ahead and add that to the projects. So I'm going to add this to the screen here. Before I do, actually, let me just delete it for a second. Let's go ahead here and bring back the transparency. So we see how we had to lower that way down to try to show that texture. Now I'm just going to add this texture overlay right over top. Let me just go ahead and fit to the screen here. And then since I exported with the same dimensions, I can drag it from corner to corner to get it so it matches up right over top of our design there. So I have it matching. It looks like my dimensions may be a little off. I'm using that bottom edge. So again, maybe I wasn't super careful there, but I could drag it just a little bit bigger like that. And then if we just zoom in here, we can see that now we do have this nice texture that we're getting over top of this image without having to fade the whole image. And also you can fool around with the color here. So this might pop a little bit better if we made that texture sort of lighter. So I could come in here and use the same tricks you normally do. So this is the texture itself. If I go under the edit option, I go under duotone. Let's just turn the whole thing more of a lighter white color. So when I do that, now we can see this texture starts to pop out even more here. So again, coming down here, now suddenly we're really getting this texture, especially if we look down here, look at how we have this nice texture. Now you could even do something like lower the transparency of this layer if you thought it was too strong, or let me just come under the position menu so we can see our layers. You could actually duplicate this. I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate that and add another layer of that texture just if you wanted to be more pronounced. So you have all these ways of coming in and strengthening this texture, but suddenly you're getting this nice overlay here. So I'm using two layers of my overlay, so let me group it together. And then if I wanted to come in here and easily swap in a new image, well, I'd have to just drag slightly over so I could see the frame below here. Come under my Elements tab. Let's find a different picture. So let's drag in this picture, re-expand out my texture. And just like that, I'm able to use this as sort of a mock-up template where I can easily drag in different pictures that I might want to see on this canvas frame. This is just an example of how sometimes if you use tools like Photopea outside of Canva, you can create assets that then you can bring in and get better results than if you use just Canva alone. Now in that first canvas example we looked at, we're talking about a flat surface and one that is directly facing the camera. It's not angled away at all. In another video, I talk about a situation where you do have something at an angle and there is a Reshape app in Canva you can use if you want to apply that transformation. I will link that tutorial above and also down in the comments. But I also mentioned in that tutorial, it's not something where you can set up a template where you can then drag in an image and the transformation gets auto applied. If you want to do something like that, you have to step out and you have to use other software. So I show you how in Photopea and Photoshop and software like that, you can set up a smart object and then you can do something where that transformation gets auto-applied every time you drag a new image into that smart object. So sometimes it's about finding the workflow that is going to be the most efficient and save you the most time. With that in mind, let's look at a few more examples where we're not talking about a flat surface, so we may have to step out of Canva and find some other tools that can help us. So let's take a look at the example of this coffee mug and imagine we wanted to be able to place an image on this coffee mug. We wanted to set up a template for that so we could drop in new images. So we have a couple issues here. So the lighting in the scene, we're getting some shadows and some reflections on this mug here because this is sort of a reflective surface. And then of course the biggest issue with this is the curvature of the mug, because if we just place a flat image in here, it is not going to look like it's on this coffee mug because it's not going to be distorted the way we would expect something as it wraps around the surface of this mug. So let's see how we would tackle this problem. And we're working again in Photopea here. This is photopea.com. I recommend Photoshop if you have that, or you can use something like Affinity Photo, but we're going to work here in Photopea since this is a free tool you can access. So what I'm going to do is start by placing a new image in this scene, the image that we want to wrap around this mug. So to do that, I'm going to come up under the File menu, and I'm going to choose this Open in Place option. So I choose Open in Place, I find the photo I want to place on top, and I choose Open. And then when it comes in, I'm going to have a chance to resize it. So I'm just going to grab the corner handle here, and I'm going to start to sort of size it down so that it fits just a little bit beyond the edges of my mug where I want it to wrap. And as I do that, maybe I'll lower down the transparency so we can see a little bit better the mug behind it. Now, an important step for this. You want the size of this to represent sort of the surface area that exists on the mug or the surface you're going to be wrapping to. So if I thought a square image is what would fit around this, then I would want to bring in a square image. If I bring something in that's like super tall and not as wide, it's going to have to stretch that, or vice versa, it might have to squash it down. So we want to sort of guesstimate what the surface area is here on this mug, the width and dimensions we need of an image for it to wrap properly and not look overly stretched. In other words, we have to fake it reasonably well for this to work. So this looks like maybe this is going to be a little bit wider than it is tall, but maybe not quite as wide as my image here. This image might be a little bit beyond width-wise what I need, and so that might make it look a little bit more squashed. So I might want to edit this first and sort of get rid of some of the edges. However, you'll see this little symbol right here. When you use the Open in Place command, remember we went File, Open in Place, it gets placed here in Photoshop as a smart object. A smart object is basically a linked file. That means I can double click on this, and when I do it, actually it's going to open that image because this image is now linked and embedded in this other project here. And that's going to help us in the long run if we're using this as a template. But right now we need to be aware of this because if I'm in this original image where I have the in this original project where I have the smart object linked, if I just go to try to delete something in here, let's say I want to delete this edge, I'm on this layer, I hit delete, it's going to give me a warning message and say smart object must be rasterized first. Well, if we rasterize this, we're going to get rid of this smart object. It's just going to collapse this down to pixels that exist within this document. We don't want to do that. We want to retain this smart object and retain this linked file. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control D to deselect. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the dimensions of this by going into the smart object. So again, I can double click to get into that smart object. And then within here, I'll choose the crop tool. I'm going to grab this side. I'm going to hold down the Alt key. That's on Windows. This will be optional on Mac. Just to drag in a little bit from each side. And I would say roughly maybe this area here is going to represent the amount of area on that coffee mug in terms of width and height dimensions. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and click Enter. And when I do, let's see, the Enter didn't seem to work. Let's try that again. So let me go ahead and use this check to commit that. There we go. We've committed the crop. And now we have this. I can actually save this because you see how I have the asterisk here. I have not saved that yet. So I want to go ahead and click File, Save. So Save Smart Object. And when I do that now and I jump back over into the coffee mug project, we'll see that the dimensions of this photo has changed because we're working with this linked smart object. I cropped the smart object image and now so it's cropped in this file here. So now what I'm going to do is I'll lower down the opacity a little bit so I can see that coffee mug below. And I'm just going to position this roughly over the mug where I think it's going to roughly fit. So let me just size it down so we fit the height, because it's going to basically come to this part of the mug, this part on the bottom, and then let me get it centered. And so that's roughly where I want it placed. Okay, so that's step one. However, we don't want it to just sit here as a flat image. Let me raise up the transparency on this. Now below this, I actually have a mask layer, and if I click on this mask, so I'm going to use this Alt command and click on the mask here, and let me just Alt click so we can actually see the mask itself. I've basically masked out, represented in this white area, the area of this coffee mug. So if I were to come here and take this mask here and drag it up using the Alt command, as I hold down the Alt, drag it onto this layer, so now suddenly I have this mask to my coffee mug. Now, it looks sort of reasonable, but you can sort of tell that this transformation isn't quite right, because we have a flat image sitting in this masked area. And a lot of times when you see mockups, this is where a mockup fails. It doesn't do the required transformation. So look at the way her elbow is sort of sticking out directly to the side. That should be wrapping around the coffee mug, and it's just not quite good enough to really sell this. And that's because we haven't done any transformation yet on this layer. So we are going to want this mask, but first I'm going to go ahead and come in here and let's just turn off this mask. So I'm going to right click on the mask here and disable it for the moment. So now we can see the full image, because I want to come in here and perform a transform on this image so that it wraps around the mug. And again, this is something where you can't do this sort of advanced transform within Canva. That's why we're stepping out into Photopea, where we have that ability. We also have smart objects, and both of those are going to help us in this instance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to perform a transform on this layer, but before I do, I want to unlink the mask from the layer itself, because I want this transform to be on the image but not on the mask. The shape of my mask represents now the surface area of that coffee mug. I want to keep that, so I'm going to just click this button here to unclick, and then I'll just make sure I'm on the layer itself here, and then I'm going to come up to this edit menu, and I'm going to come down and find this transform option, and underneath here I'm going to choose this warp option. So when you choose this warp option here, basically you get a grid, and you can apply some custom presets here if you wanted to do a custom preset, or you can change the number of sort of columns and rows in your grid, but this is going to suffice for what I need to do now. So when I have this, if I click in any of these cells, I can click and drag and start to change the shape of my image. This sort of acts like a mesh where you can move around points, and then also if you click on corner points, you're going to get control handles. But let's just start by sort of aligning the curvature of the mug. So I'm just going to click right in the center here and drag this down to roughly where we need it to be. Now I want it to be just beyond the edge of the mask. I'm going to be careful not to drag any of these too far. And then what I can do is start to move in my corner points. So let's bring this one in here, because it's going to need to be in here. And then we see we have these control handles, which we're going to get to in a minute. But right now I'm just roughly positioning the corners. And if you need to see what you're doing, see the mug below, you can come up here and lower down the opacity a little bit so you can see through to that mug underneath. So again, bringing in the corners here, let's bring this in to roughly there. Now I lost the warp thing I was in, so let's just go ahead there, click on warp again to bring that back. I lost it for a second there when I left. So let's go to there. Let's bring down this one to over here. This one's up here. Let's get this center drag down so it's right at the bottom. And then we're going to have to play around with these control handles here. Again, we can tuck this one in a little bit up here. Start to bring in these control handles to represent the direction we want this to go. And again, this is not going to be perfect. If you wanted to really get something perfect, you might want to get into a 3D modeling software like Maya or Blender, but obviously then we're talking about a huge learning curve, and we're trying to keep things relatively simple. We are going to have to spend some time learning tools like this in Photopea or Photoshop, but that's a smaller learning curve, learning a few tricks that are really going to help you extend Canva versus going in and using something like a 3D modeling software, which might even be more complicated. So we're just going to tuck this in a little bit up here, make sure we're roughly following the curvature of this mug. Let's pull this out a little bit at the bottom, keep this one here. Again, I'm going beyond sort of the surface area I'm needing, and I'm not trying to get these angles perfect. I just want it to look like this flows around the curvature of my mug. Again, not getting it totally perfect, but good enough that we're faking it. We're just trying to fake it well enough that it's going to work. So again, this is far from perfect here. Let me just tuck this out a little bit so I'm not losing anything. Far from perfect, but we're going to call it good enough. Then when you want to commit your changes, go ahead and click the check button here. And then of course we have it going beyond the edges of our coffee mug, but we do want to apply this mask here. So if I come down here, right click and enable this mask again, and now I can link it back up to my layer. And so now we have this texture mapped to our coffee mug, this image mapped to our coffee mug, transformed so it looks a little bit more realistic in terms of how it's wrapping around the coffee mug. Before, you could see our elbows sticking way out. You could tell it was a flat image on top of a curved surface. Now we have a little bit more of a realistic look. And then of course we have all the other tools available in here. So I could use blending modes. So I could come in here, let's change this to overlay so it starts to bring back the light and shadow areas. And then of course I have the opacity lower down. You could have it full opacity, but maybe to match the scene a little bit better, let's bring that opacity back down a little bit so it just matches the coloring of the scene a little bit better. Okay, so this is why with Canva it may not work for an image like this, because there is no way to do this sort of transform easily within Canva. Now suddenly here we can do a better job. Now I have a little bit of an imperfection here, so I could come adjust my mask if I needed to have that look a little bit better up top. So you can play around, make things so they look really good. And then the beauty of this is, because this is a smart object, we can save this file. So let's go ahead and save this coffee mug mockup example. I'm going to go ahead and click File, Save. I can even close that now. Here was the other image. I can close that now. But if I go ahead and open this back up from my computer, so this was coffee mug mockup example right here, this one here. So if I open this back up again, we have the image. And if I were to now double click again on this smart object layer, remember this is a separate file, and then the transform is being applied on top of that. So if I were to come in here and place a new image in here, so let's just go File, let's go Open in Place. So let's go Open in Place. Let me look and see what I have in this licensed Adobe stock. Let's see if I have some images here. So let's say I wanted this image of this elephant here, or this dog here. Let's just choose this dog photo here. You can't see it because it's going slightly out of my screen here, but let me just go ahead and open that up and we'll see it come in here. And so I could size this up in here. So let's just scale it up a little bit so we're covering the full area here. I'll scale up and center a little bit, something like that. And then I could even go ahead and hit enter to commit that. And then I could even come in here and I could rasterize this layer, because we don't care about it being anything except on top of this. But now if I were to save this, so again, File, Save Smart Object. Now before I save it, let's go back and look at this. We still have this image here, but watch what happens as soon as I save this change here in this file, because this is a linked file. File, Save Smart Object, just like that. And now if I jump back over here into my original, we can see that suddenly I have this new image on here. The transform is being applied. All the other things we've done are being applied. So very quickly, I could come in here and update this image on this coffee mug and have a realistic mock-up template. So this is just one example. We're going to look at another example here in a minute, but you have additional tools here in programs like Photopea, Photoshop, other programs I'm sure, where you can just do more realistic mock-ups than you can do in Canva. Now, before we move on from this example, we mentioned we're not using a 3D modeling thing. We're not going for perfect here. We're going for good enough. And what is good enough often may depend on what sort of image you're using. Let's just illustrate that with an example. So if we had an image that had straight lines into it, then suddenly if we're just placing it right on top of here, it's going to look really flat. It's going to be really obvious we're not curving it around the object. So in contrast to that, if we click through and we had the same image here in our smart object, and we're going to go ahead and file and save that, and then jump back over here. Once we've saved that, then we'll see that suddenly it is curving more realistically around the coffee mug. Now, if I look at this closely though, this is not perfect. Obviously, I'm not getting this perfectly modeled around my mug. Now, again, this is a case of what is good enough. And this is one reason why if you do have something with straight lines on it, or maybe you want to start with an image with straight lines on it when you do that transform, because if you have those lines as a guide, that's going to let you do a little bit better job when you're doing that transform. I was just using that image of the woman with the sunflowers, so maybe I could have done a better job if I'd used an image like this when I sort of did my initial transform, and then I'm going to get an even better result. So you can start with whatever image you want, because using that smart object, we can then swap in that image later. So again, something to think about, and remember, your goal is good enough. And what is good enough is going to depend. So we're going to look now at another example where we're using a blanket, where we're trying to create a blanket mockup, and we're going to see that sometimes we can even take assets back to Canva and maybe call that good enough. It really comes down to what your material is, what the look you're going for is, can you fake it enough to make it realistic? And so that really is how you want to answer your question. What's good enough for your end needs? Okay, let's look at another example. Let's look at this blanket. Let's imagine we want to be able to create mockups so we can make it look like we have a printed image on this blanket. So we're going to look at another way you can sort of warp and transform an image here with something like Photopea or Photoshop, but then we're also going to talk about, do we really need to do that? Is that a necessary step? And if we don't need to do that, can we actually just take some assets back to Canva if we want to work into Canva? Because there are going to be advantages of both programs. We see the way we can use smart objects in a program like this, but then in Canva, we have that vast library of assets. So it's also very helpful to work in a program like that where we can just drag things in very quickly and try out different images on our mockup template. So these are all things to consider, but so let's look at how we would tackle this here in Photopea. So we're going to use Photopea to get assets we can take back, but then we're going to also look at another method where we can do a different kind of transform, a different kind of distortion here if we want to make it look like it's not a flat surface. So let's take a look at the different layers I have in the project. So first of all, on the bottom here, we just have the blanket image that we want to turn into our mockup template. And so we're going to have to pay attention to these shadows, these folds. There's also a texture here on this blanket that we're going to want to be able to replicate in some way. And there also is a little bit of a drop shadow falling behind the blanket because where it has these curves, it's sort of sitting up above the surface. So we are getting that shadow. So I've also just created a solid fill layer, and I also went ahead and put that shadow layer, just using some selection tools, up on its own layer. And then I also have the blanket itself isolated on a layer. So let's begin talking about the displacement options we have in here. I also have this grid layer up top here. And we're going to use this grid layer just to, again, look at the way we can transform displace pixels here in a program like Photopea. So we saw that warp tool in the last lesson. So let me just lower the transparency here. And again, if I were to go under this image and go edit, and I was going to come down to transform and then find this warp option here, I could start to come in here and mess around with how this curves around the surface below. So I have right now a 3x3 grid, but you can come in here and add additional grid lines. So I could put a grid line here, then I could start to move things around. So things start to curve this way, things start to curve that way. But you can imagine with something as complicated as this surface here, you would have to do a lot of work. This would be very tedious and very hard to get right. Well, there is another way we can do this. So let me just go ahead and undo what I did. So I'm going to hit Control Z to bring it back so we don't have this curved yet. There is another way we can do this. And before we do this, what I'm going to want to do is convert this grid into a smart object, because again, when we do this transform on this, we want it to be something where we can swap in a new image. So I'm going to go ahead and take this grid here, and let's just go ahead and convert to smart objects. So now we see that smart object symbol. Now I'm going to turn it off for a minute. And now we're going to think about how we can transform this another way. There's something in programs like this called a displacement map. And with a displacement map, basically what you do is you point to a layer or a file, and then it uses black and white values in that image. And based on whether it's black or white, it'll push and move pixels around. So since this blanket represents how we want things to move around, we can use this to sort of fake some movement on an image. So let's go ahead and see how we're going to do this. So I'm going to take this blanket layer here, and I'm just going to create a duplicate copy of this. So I'm going to click right on the layer itself and duplicate the layer. Now for this layer here, I'm going to go ahead and apply this layer mask so we have just the blanket itself. And if we want to see just that layer, I'll hit the Alt so we can see we're just working on just this layer. Now I want this to be black and white. So it looks like this is already desaturated, but just to be sure, I'll come under Image Adjustments, and we're going to go ahead and desaturate this. So there's no color value here. We're just interested in those grayscale values. So If I want to push this even farther, I can do something like a levels adjustment. So I'm going to hit Control L on my keyboard to bring up the levels dialog. And this lets you just adjust your black points and your white points. So maybe I'm going to drag it in so we have a tighter tonal range. And I'm going to go ahead and do something like this here. So we're getting sort of this black and white image that represents sort of just a grayscale value that sort of shows the folds within the material itself. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now, the issue with this is because of all this texture value, if I zoom in and we can see all these little splotches, if I use this as my displacement map, these little values, this texture in here is really going to make things look distorted. So let me just zoom out so we can see this. So I'll go ahead and zoom out a little bit here so we can see everything again, fit it into screen. But for the moment, I'm going to leave this layer as it is. I'll make a copy of it so we have a copy. So Control J to make a copy. But right now I'm going to work with this mask copy, this original copy. So if I wanted to use this as a displacement map, what I need to do is turn this into a smart object. So I'm going to right click. Again, I'm going to turn it into a smart object, convert to smart object, and we can see this mask copy, blanket mask copy is now a smart object. So what I can do is actually turn that off now. If I come up to this grid layer now, let me go ahead and bring the opacity back up. Okay, it's at 100%. This is a good issue to bring up. It's not actually at 100%, we can see, but that's because it's a smart object now. So if I go over to the smart object, within the smart object, we can see the opacity is turned down. So that's what was happening. So again, File, Save Smart Object. And then if we jump back here to the original, we can see, okay, now it makes sense. So you got to pay attention to these things when you're working with a smart object. Your opacity might be controlled on that original smart object and not in the file you're working on. Okay, so I want to apply some distortion to this, and to distort it, I am going to use this blanket mask copy here where we've created sort of this just black and white layer. Okay, but it does represent the folds of the blanket. So I'm going to come here under this grid here, and now what you're going to do is you're going to come under this filter menu, you're going to come down and find this distort option, and then you're going to find this displace. And when you do this, it's going to let you choose anything in your file that is a smart object. So I have that grid smart object, and then I have the blanket mask copy. So we're going to choose that mask copy, and we can see how this starts to get distorted. And we can fool around here with how much the pixels are shifting. So if I come in here and start to adjust these numbers even more, we can see it becomes more exaggerated. Now, if I wanted to see through to the layer below, I could turn the blanket back on. So let me actually close this first. Let me turn the blanket on so we can see what's happening. I'll lower the transparency of this grid layer down a little bit just so we can start to see, and I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit too, just so we can start to see some of the folds in the blanket and then see how our grid is acting above it to see if it looks a little bit like it's following the contour of the blanket. Sometimes you might want to do that as you do this. So again, coming under the filter menu, we're coming under this distort option, and we're finding this displace option. We are coming down here, we are finding that smart object layer, and then we can come in here and we can start to fool around so we can see that as we do this, it's making it look a little bit more like this is following the contours of the blanket. And again, you can fool around with the horizontal and vertical movement as you need to. But again, I mentioned before, look at how pixelated some of this is. And so let me just cancel out of this. That is because when we came in here, we didn't do anything about the texture. So let me turn this off. So we made this layer here. We didn't do anything about the texture. So let's come under this copy here, this mask copy too. And this time, in addition to what I did, I'm also going to apply a blur to this just to get rid of these small textured areas. So I'm going to go under Filter. I'm going to go under Blur. I'm going to go down to Gaussian Blur. Because what you want is something that shows the shadow areas, but you don't want all those little pixelated dots. You want something that's going to be smooth. So I'm going to push this to maybe something like this where it looks pretty smooth. Then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now let's see, when we go back to this grid layer here, we're going to use this mask copy 2 instead of the mask copy 1, this first one, just to see the difference that makes. So now back on my grid layer here, I'm going to come under Filter. We're going to come under the Blur tool once again. Excuse me, we're going to go under Filter Distort. We're going to choose this Displace. And now instead of choosing mask copy 1, we're going to choose mask copy 2. But what did I do? I forgot to turn it into a smart object. So let's come up here. Let's convert this to a smart object. So convert to smart object. Then we'll come back up here under the filter menu. We're going to find the distort option. We're going to choose displace. And then this time we're going to find this mask copy 2. And now as we move things around, we can see things distort. We can see it start to move around our contour as we make these adjustments. Again, figuring out what sort of vertical adjustments you might want to make, what sort of horizontal adjustments you might want to make. And again, it's hard to get this to look perfect, but you're just, again, trying to make it look a little bit more realistic. And so you're coming in here and choosing what values you want for these distort values, these displace values, and then go ahead and click OK, and it's applying those changes. So now we have something here where if this was a blanket itself, obviously this grid over top of it would not have just flat lines. It would start to bend around the contour, and it does look a little bit more realistic here with what we've done by using this displace map. Now, of course, we might want this to be an image over top and not this grid, and that's why we turn this grid into a smart object. So if I just come and double click on this grid, now we can jump in here. So let's place an image in here. So I'm going to go ahead and choose File. Let's choose Open and Place. We'll grab this sunflower image just like we used in the last example. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. We'll come in here. I'm going to size it up a little bit. Wouldn't want to size something up beyond the resolution that was supported, but this is going to be okay, so we'll go ahead and do that. We'll choose this check mark to commit the changes. Remember, you have to file, save the smart object, and then when I come back over to the blanket mockup, suddenly now we have this image over top, and we're starting to get something where maybe it looks a little bit more realistic in terms of wrapping around the blanket. So let me just go ahead and throw this mask on here so we have it masked down to the blanket layer. And so now suddenly we have something in here that's a little bit more realistic. Now, of course, we could come in here, we could fool around with things like the blend mode. We could do other things to bring the shadows out if we want to. So again, this is just giving us something where we get a more realistic result. And it looks more like this is actually curving around the blanket. Now, as mentioned, this could be your endpoint. You could just stop here. Maybe you want to make use of the smart object. Maybe you want to make use of a program like this. There's certainly advantages to doing that. However, you do have some other options. So instead of it doing this way, you could decide that you do want to try to take some assets back to Canva. In other words, we're doing this distort on this image here, but sometimes just the shadow and texture is enough to fake it. Sometimes doing this extra transform where you actually distort something like this, it's just not needed. It can make things look more realistic, but sometimes just when you're looking at an image quickly, you can't necessarily even tell. Sometimes the shadow is enough to do that. Sometimes the texture is enough to do that. So it really just depends on what you think is good enough. If it's something where it's just going to look fake, yeah, you might want to stay and work in Photopea and do this every time. You make use of the smart object so you can just drop it in every time. But if you want to have something in Canva so you can make use of those Canva assets and drop something into a frame quickly, then we can create a frame, we can create a shadow overlay, we can create a texture overlay, and we can take all those back to Canva. So let's look at that now. How would we do that if we actually want to take assets back to Canva for this sort of blanket mockup? Okay, so I'm thinking about the same things. I'm thinking about texture, I'm thinking about the lighting and the shadows. I'm thinking about this transformation, but I realize I can't do the same sort of transforms. I don't have blending modes in Canva, so there are different ways I have to think about this. So let me just start by moving this blanket to the top layer here so we can see this. I'll once again come in here and we're just going to apply this mask here. We'll turn everything off for now. Now, the first thing I do is I already have the shape because I made a selection in here. So let me just zoom out slightly. I made a selection, so I have a selection area all around my blanket here. So this is something that I actually want to take back into Canva as a mask because I want to be able to put something perfectly on top of this without it going beyond it. So I'm going to create a mask here. And when I say mask, I'm going to create a custom frame for Canva. I have some other videos on this channel where I talk about how you create a custom frame for Canva, so I can link that up above and down in the comments below. But you can basically take any shape you want. You can turn it into a custom frame for Canva. So I'm going to work the steps real quick here now, but again, I'll have another tutorial linked if you want to learn exactly how to do this. So with the selection now, I'm just going to go under this path menu. I'll find this option here. I'm going to turn that into a path, and then I'm going to come back to my layers here. Let me just create a new layer. So I'll use this new layer button. I'm just going to choose a fill here, and I'm just going to fill this with black or something like that. So we'll fill it with the background color, which is black, and go ahead and click OK. And now I'm just going to come under here and go choose, let's see, layer, vector mask, current path. And so right now, this layer right here is going to represent what I'm going to be able to take back to Canva as a custom frame that's going to be this shape. Okay, so I'll export that at the end, but let me go ahead now and create my other assets. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off and again work on this blanket layer. So I have the basic shape now, but what I want to do now is to be able to create overlays I can take back into Canva that represent the texture and shadow areas of this image. So I did once before a selection where I made a selection based on luminosity, and that makes a lot of sense when you're trying to grab texture, because those differences in brightness really are going to represent the texture in your image. So if you remember from before, I did that by coming under the channel and control clicking on this RGB layer. Now, what matters here is the brightness of the pixels. It is selecting the white areas completely, anything that's pure white. If it's pure black, it's not going to select anything. If it's 50% gray, it would do like a partial selection, 50% selection. And so it's doing that, selecting the brightest areas. However, if I were to come back to the layers now and just Control J to copy what I've selected onto a new layer, really what I've done is I've selected the highlights in this image. And so if I turn off this blanket layer and see what that looks like here over top of this, what's going to be a blanket, we get these areas that sort of represent highlights, almost like if there was a sheen or reflection. Well, that doesn't make sense in this instance, because when we're talking about a blanket like this, we're not talking about a reflective surface. So you have to think about the material you're working with. So what I really wanted to do was select the opposite of this. So let me just hit Control Z on my keyboard until we get back to where I had that selection. And now with this selection highlighted again, let me just come and select the inverse of that. So again, I selected all the highlighted areas, but I want to come in and select the inverse of that. And so now if I hit Control J and copy that up to another layer, now we can see that we really do have something that's representative of the texture we need for this. Now, here's my issue with this selection right here. It's kind of okay in the shadow areas here, but then everything else is a little too dark. I would want to come in and lower the transparency of this, which is fine. I can do that. So I could come in here on this new layer, and I could take this texture layer, and I could just lower down the opacity. Something like this is maybe starting to look good. The problem is my shadows now are too bright. So I lowered down the texture to where I like it on the rest of the image, but in the shadow areas, it's really not dark enough. So what I'm going to need to do is duplicate this layer, and I'll have one sort of underlying texture layer, but then I'm going to have another area where I just sort of enhance the shadow detail. So what I'm going to do now is actually duplicate this layer here, this texture layer, but let's change the name. Let's call this texture. And then the next one, we're going to create a second texture layer. So I'm going to create a copy of that. So I'm just going to hit Control J to duplicate this whole layer. And so now I have this texture copy layer. Now on this texture copy layer, let me bump the opacity up all the way, because we really want it to be pronounced in that shadow area. But what I want to do is I want to paint some of this out so that I don't see this much texture on the entire image. So I can do that using my layer mask here. So if I alt click just to see the layer mask, you remember that the layer mask, the white areas are going to show all the way through, black's not going to show at all, and then anything in between is going to partially show. So let me just click back on the layer itself, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to click over here, so I'm actually painting on the mask, and I'm going to paint with black. So let me grab a paintbrush. Let's make sure it has a soft edge. And then we're going to lower the flow down. So I have the flow set to 18. That means it's not going to put down tons and tons of paint each time. So I'm going to be able to slowly build up sort of the paint I have here. So I can use my bracket keys to change the size of my cursor on the fly, and then I'm going to start to put down some paint right on this mask just to bring back some detail, to brighten this up. So I'm going to go in here and start to work out the areas. I'm going to try to keep the dark shadows, so Control Z if I want to undo a keystroke, but I'm going to try to bring back some of the areas where I don't want quite as much showing through. So I'm not going to make you watch all this, so I will speed up this recording, and then we'll see what this end result looks like. Okay, so not perfect, but now we can see what it looks like when we add on this additional texture layer. And you wouldn't always have to do it separately like this. Sometimes I think you could grab all the shadow areas at once, but this was complicated enough. I think it made sense to sort of come back and sort of do this touch up on an extra layer. So it really just comes down to the individual image, what the details are and how realistic you want it to be. But given this two texture layers, I think we can just get a more realistic representation of the texture and shadows. So now I have something where I could start to export layers to take back into Canva. And if I wanted to, I could clap these texture layers into one texture overlay. But I think it makes sense to keep them as separate overlay layers so I can sort of independently control the deeper shadows and the non-shadow areas. And so if I start to turn off things here, we can start to see that we have these image with transparency here. So if I turn off everything except for the one texture layer here, I can export this. So let's export this as a PNG. So I'm going to go File. I'm going to go Save As, or excuse me, Export as PNG. And so we'll go ahead and choose Save. And let's call this one, so let's call this Blanket Main Texture. So just give it a name that we're going to recognize, Blanket Main Texture, Save. And we're going to save it just into this blanket mockup folder right here. So blanket main texture, save, and then we'll turn that off, and then we're going to turn this one on, and we're going to save this one. And again, I can make other adjustments if I wanted to, but I think this is okay. So I'm going to call this one File Export as PNG, and we're going to call this one Blanket Shadows, and we'll go ahead and click Save on that as well. And again, we're going to save that off to that same folder there. And these are all assets we're going to bring back into Canva. Now, the other thing that we have here is, remember, I have that shadow underneath the blanket. So I'm going to call this one File Export As, and we're going to go again to PNG, and we're going to call this, just call it something like Under Shadow, something we're going to recognize as we bring it in here. And because all these are coming from the same file with the same dimensions here, I'm going to be able to get them to lay over top of each other. So we'll save that as well. And then the other thing we have in here is just the basic shape. I don't know if you remember, we created this here where we have this, where we converted it into something that's going to be a Canva frame. And again, if you're not sure of that process, I do have that video linked down in the description below, so you can check that out. But we're going to export this now as a PDF, because this is something we're going to bring into Canva as a frame. So we're going to go ahead and export this. So we're going to go this time export as, and we're going to choose this PDF option this time. We can leave all of this turned off, and we're just going to go ahead and export this as a PDF. So we're going to put that blanket mockup, let's just call this frame since this is the PDF, and we'll do that. Now we can go over to Canva and bring all these assets into Canva so we can see what our actual final Canva working mockup blanket template is going to look like. So here we are back in Canva. First, I'm going to grab what I just created as a PDF, which is going to be our frame. And if I drag that onto the home screen, it's going to start to load here. And we'll see if I click on this and open this, that I can detach this image. And so yes, I have created a frame to represent this shape. Now, we had the sunflower image before, but now we're going to be able to use any image we want in here. So let me just come under the elements, and we'll search for something like wildlife. I don't know, you can search for whatever you thought you would want to have printed on a blanket. And now we're going to be able to see a representation of what maybe that might look like. So let's just start with maybe this scene with this parrot here. So we're just going to drop him in there. Obviously, it doesn't look realistic at all yet because we don't have the texture, we don't have the shadows, we don't have those other areas we want in here. So let me go and find those textures we created, those overlays we created. So it was under this blanket mockup here. So we have this under shadow, that's one, but we also have this blanket main texture, and then we also have a blanket shadows. So let's grab all three of those and bring those in here. And so let's start by just grabbing this under shadow here. So again, if I put this on, it should size correctly because they're all coming from that same document here. So I can position that like that. Obviously, then I'll use my bracket keys to move that to the back. So now we're starting to look like we have this shadow behind this blanket. Let's use these other ones here. So this one here, let me click on that. And again, this is going to want to go into your frame, but you can just make sure your cursor isn't on the frame, or you can hold down that control key and it's not going to snap into the frame. But what I want to do is come come over here and make sure I do get it perfectly aligned with that corner and then perfectly aligned below. So now suddenly we're adding that more realistic texture over top of our blanket. And then that's the shadow areas, actually the deep shadow areas. But now let's bring this main texture up. And once again, I'm going to grab this, position it here, and resize it to the screen. And so that now suddenly, because we did all this extra work, we're having something that looks fairly realistic in terms of creating a blanket here. Now, we are not doing that transformation. We are not using any displacement. But again, I mentioned to you, it's what's good enough for your purpose. I don't really think you're going to notice too much that this isn't conforming to the folds of the blanket. If you look very closely, maybe, depending on the image, you might, but a lot of times you're going to get away with this. And so now that we have all this here, we can very easily drop in new images. Now, if I come under the Elements tab here and I just try to drop something in, it's not dropping in because they have those texture layers over top. So what you need to do here is sort of drag those temporarily out of the way. So let me just come under the position, under this layers menu. Let's go ahead and group our two textures together since we want those to always stay together. Let's group. I'm going to fit to the screen here just so we can see everything. And then with those grouped together, all I have to do is temporarily come in here and grab them like this. So I'm exposing part of the frame. Didn't mean to move it. Hit Control Z to undo that move. But now if I come under the Elements tab, now let's just search for wildlife again. And let's say, hey, let's see all. Okay, I wanted the blanket to be this bear here. So I drag that in. Take your texture, just expand it back out so it fits. And then boom, we're taking a look at what another possible mock-up would be. Anything we want here, let's come in here, let's find something different. So maybe we like this scene here. Boom, let's see what that would look like as a blanket. Boom, drag it in. Now with all these, you might say with some of these, okay, the shadow's looking a little too harsh. You can always come in here, you can always ungroup these. So let's ungroup these. And then once again, you can come in here and you can independently adjust these layers if you want the shadows to be less, more pronounced. So it just gives you a lot of layers of control, and you can use this as a template within Canva that works for trying different images, okay? So again, mockups. It really depends on what your needs are, those four things that we mentioned before. So lighting and shadows, texture. Is it a flat surface? Is it something where you have to transform pixels in some way? And is it a material where there's reflective material? So these are all things you think about, and then based on that, you can make a decision whether it's something where you need other tools, or you can use those other tools, but then bring some assets back into Canva that are going to work for you well enough, okay? So I hope you learned something, and I hope you have fun trying out these techniques, and I'd love to see what you create.
Everything I do, so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move, so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that. Spitting slow, spitting fast. I could roast, I could gas. Think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past.